Brittany Zimmermann never noticed the way Eli Hawthorne watched her. Living just across the hall, he blended into the background, a quiet, unremarkable neighbor. But behind his ordinary facade lurked an obsession that had been growing for weeks, festering in the shadows of her everyday life. By the time she realized the danger, it was too late. Brittany Zimmermann was the kind of person who lit up a room without even trying. She had an effortless charm, a contagious laugh, and a drive for success that inspired those around her. As a college student, on the verge of graduation, she had spent years working toward a future that now seemed within reach. She balanced her studies with a part-time job at a local bookstore, often staying up late to study and pushing herself to excel in every aspect of her life. Her apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, a place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors without a second thought. She had lived there for nearly 2 years, sharing the space with her roommate, Selena Grisham. The two were close, almost like sisters. But Selena had been out of town that week, visiting family in another state. Brittany, always independent, had no problem staying alone. The last time anyone had spoken to her was the evening before her disappearance. Her best friend, Darian Lowe, had called her around 7 p.m. to check in. She had sounded normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing seemed off. They had spoken about their upcoming plans for the weekend, a casual conversation with no indication that anything was wrong. The next morning, everything changed. Brittany was supposed to be in class at 9 a.m. sharp. She never missed a lecture, let alone an important exam. When she failed to show up, her professor, Dr. Callum Vexley, took notice. He assumed something minor had come up. Maybe she had overslept or fallen ill. But when the day dragged on and she still hadn't responded to any messages or emails, concern began to grow. By the afternoon, Darian started to worry. He had sent multiple texts and called her several times, but his messages remained unread. At first, he tried to convince himself that she had simply lost her phone or was too busy to respond. But Brittany wasn't the type to go off the grid without warning. She was always connected, always reliable. Selena, still out of town, received a call from Darian, who asked if she had heard from Brittany. When she said no, panic set in. Together they decided to check on her. Darian drove straight to her apartment complex, hoping to find some simple explanation, something that would make all the worry seem ridiculous. But as soon as he arrived, a sickening feeling settled in his stomach. Her car was parked in its usual spot. The lights in her apartment were off and the curtains were drawn. Darian knocked on the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps from inside. Silence. He knocked again, harder this time, but still, there was nothing. He pressed his ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement. He wasn't the only one worried. A neighbor, an older woman who lived down the hall, had noticed the eerie quiet as well. She mentioned that Brittany usually left for class early in the morning, but that day she hadn't seen her at all. Something wasn't right. Darian tried calling her phone again. From outside the door, he heard the faint sound of a ringtone, coming from inside the apartment. Brittany's phone was there, but she wasn't answering. By early evening, authorities were contacted. Officers arrived and assessed the situation. The door was locked, with no signs of forced entry. After several attempts to reach her, they made the decision to enter the apartment. The moment the door swung open, the air inside felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. The officers stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit space. Brittany's belongings were untouched. Her purse sat on the counter, her shoes neatly placed by the door. The atmosphere was unnervingly still. As they moved further inside, one of the officers called out her name, but there was no response. They turned the corner into the bedroom, and that's when they saw her. Brittany Zimmermann was no longer missing. She was dead. The apartment that had once been a safe and familiar space now felt cold and lifeless. Officers stepped carefully into the dimly lit bedroom, their eyes scanning every detail. Brittany Zimmermann lay motionless on the floor, her body positioned unnaturally. The bruises on her arms and the deep wound on her neck painted a grim picture of what had happened. The air smelled faintly of stale perfume mixed with something metallic, something unmistakably tied to violence. Nothing about the crime scene suggested a robbery. Brittany's belongings remained untouched. Her wallet sat on the nightstand with cash inside. Her laptop was open on the desk, and her jewelry box had not been disturbed. If someone had broken in, they hadn't come for valuables. They had come for her. Near the bed, officers found a broken lamp, its shattered pieces scattered across the carpet. The way the shards lay suggested it had fallen during a struggle. The bedspread was slightly pulled back, as if Brittany had been sitting or lying down before the attack. A chair near the desk was overturned, and a half-written note rested beside it. The words on the paper were barely legible, hastily scribbled as if written in a moment of panic. One sentence stood out among the fragmented thoughts. "He won't stop." Detectives arrived shortly after, treating the apartment as a crime scene. They took photographs of every detail, dusted for fingerprints, and searched for any possible clue that could lead them to whoever had done this. The most significant discovery came from the broken glass. A single fingerprint, one that didn't belong to Brittany, was found on one of the shards. If they could match it, they might have a suspect. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they considered the last known contact Brittany had with anyone. Her phone records showed that her final call had been to Darian Lowe at 7 p.m., which meant that whatever had happened to her occurred after that. There was no sign of forced entry, which led detectives to believe she may have known her attacker. The autopsy later confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Brittany had fought back. The bruises on her wrists suggested she had tried to push her attacker away, and defensive wounds on her hands indicated she had attempted to shield herself. The attack had been violent, but brief. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, with the deep wound on her neck worsening the assault. Whoever had done this had been deliberate and controlled. With so few signs of forced entry, investigators began considering another possibility. Had the attacker been waiting inside her apartment? If so, how had they gotten in? There were no signs that the locks had been tampered with, no broken windows or forced doors. Either Brittany had let them in, or they had a way inside that she didn't know about. Neighbors were questioned about the night of the murder. A few had reported hearing noises, muffled thuds, something heavy falling, but nothing that had immediately raised suspicion. One neighbor, Eli Hawthorne, who lived directly across the hall, mentioned hearing a strange sound just before midnight, like furniture being dragged across the floor. But at the time, he had assumed Brittany was just rearranging her apartment. As detectives dug deeper, they found another unsettling clue. Brittany's phone was still inside the apartment, resting on the floor near the bed. When officers checked her call history, they discovered that someone had attempted to erase certain messages, but the records still showed their existence. A series of messages had been sent to her in the days leading up to the murder, cryptic, threatening words that now carried a sinister weight. Whoever had sent them had wanted Brittany to be afraid, and now she was gone. Detectives shifted their focus to the people closest to Brittany Zimmermann, hoping to find someone who could provide insight into her final days. Her roommate, Selena Grisham, was still out of town when the murder occurred. She was devastated by the news and struggled to comprehend what had happened in the apartment they had shared. She explained that Brittany had never mentioned feeling unsafe, but she did recall something strange. Brittany had been locking the doors more often than usual. She had even asked Selena if she ever noticed things out of place, as if someone had been inside when they weren't home. At the time, Selena had brushed it off as paranoia, but now she wondered if Brittany had sensed something was wrong. Brittany's best friend, Darian Lowe, was also questioned. He had been the last person to speak to her the night before her murder. He told detectives that their conversation had been normal, but now that he thought about it, she had seemed distracted. She had hesitated before ending the call, as if something was on her mind. Darian regretted not pressing her for more details. Maybe she had been scared that night and just didn't say anything. Security footage from the apartment complex was pulled, providing a potential breakthrough. The cameras had captured a hooded figure lurking near Brittany's building just after sunset. The person kept their face hidden and moved with purpose, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. The grainy footage showed them standing near the entrance for several minutes before disappearing from view. A few hours later, the same figure was seen hurrying away from the building, their posture tense and hurried. Witnesses in the complex were questioned, but no one had gotten a clear look at the suspect. A neighbor, Eli Hawthorne, claimed he had seen a shadow pass by his peephole sometime late at night, but he had assumed it was just another resident. He also mentioned hearing muffled sounds from Brittany's apartment, but nothing that had seemed alarming at the time. Investigators needed to determine whether Brittany had known her attacker or if she had been targeted at random. When they searched her phone and computer, they found something disturbing. Weeks of anonymous messages sent from an untraceable number. The messages were brief but filled with implied threats. Some were vague warnings, while others were more direct, asking if she had been watching her back. The last message had come the night she died, reading, "I'm closer than you think." This led detectives to consider the possibility that Brittany had a stalker. If she had been receiving these messages and had started locking her doors more often, she may have sensed that someone had been following her, but she had never reported it to the police, never told her friends how much it frightened her. Had she underestimated the danger, or had she known exactly who was behind it? Forensics continued combing through the crime scene, looking for anything that could identify the killer. The fingerprint on the broken glass was sent for analysis, and DNA swabs were taken from the areas where the attacker might have left traces. They also examined the half-written note on Brittany's desk, the one with the haunting phrase, "He won't stop." The deeper investigators dug, the more questions arose. If Brittany had been in fear for weeks, why hadn't she reached out for help? Had she confided in anyone about who she suspected was watching her? Or had she convinced herself it was all in her head, until it was too late? The pressure to solve the case grew stronger as the days passed. Whoever had done this was still out there, and if Brittany had been targeted, there was no guarantee they wouldn't strike again. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the final hours of Brittany Zimmermann's life. Every lead, no matter how small, was investigated. The fingerprint found on the broken glass was processed, and soon they had a name: Victor Sloan. His record wasn't clean. He had previous arrests for burglary, trespassing, and an incident involving harassment. What stood out most was his former job. He had worked maintenance at Brittany's apartment complex until he was fired months before her murder. Investigators immediately brought him in for questioning. He denied everything. He claimed he had never been inside Brittany's apartment, insisting that there was no way his fingerprint could have been on anything in her home. But his alibi was weak. On the night of the murder, he had no solid proof of where he had been. His phone records placed him in the area at the time of the crime, and when asked why, he hesitated before offering a vague excuse about visiting an old friend. Further digging into Victor's background revealed something even more alarming. He had been reported for making residents uncomfortable in the past. Several complaints had been filed about him loitering around the complex after he was no longer employed there. Some tenants believed he had a key to at least a few of the apartments, even though management had insisted all of his access had been revoked. Had he kept a key to Brittany's unit? Investigators needed more evidence before they could move forward with charges. They searched his home, looking for anything that could tie him to the crime. What they found only deepened the mystery. Hidden in a box under his bed were old apartment keycards, including one that belonged to Brittany's building. But when tested, none of them worked for her specific unit. If Victor had been inside that night, how had he gotten in? As detectives continued to build their case against Victor, a troubling piece of evidence emerged. Brittany had told a co-worker weeks before her murder that she had the strange feeling of being watched. She hadn't named anyone specifically, but she had mentioned a man she had seen near her building multiple times. The description loosely matched Victor, but there was still no direct proof he was the one she had feared. Just when it seemed like the case was pointing squarely at him, something unexpected happened. The results from the DNA swabs taken from Brittany's apartment came back, and they didn't match Victor Sloan. The biological evidence, skin cells found under Brittany's fingernails, belonged to someone else. This revelation changed everything. If Victor wasn't the killer, then who was? The threatening messages, the break-in, the eerie feeling that someone had been watching her. Had it all been a distraction from the real culprit? Detectives shifted their focus back to Brittany's neighbors and acquaintances, re-examining everyone who might have had access to her apartment. That's when something strange stood out. Eli Hawthorne, the neighbor across the hall who had claimed to hear noises that night, had initially told officers he had seen nothing unusual. But when questioned, again, his story had subtle inconsistencies. He had claimed to have been home all night, but his phone records showed movement outside the building around the time of Brittany's death. A closer look at his background revealed something chilling: a past restraining order from an ex-girlfriend who had accused him of obsessive behavior and threats, a pattern of fixation on women who rejected him. And when police dug deeper, they found something even more damning. His fingerprints were found on Brittany's desk. Eli had been in her apartment before. The only question left was whether he had been there the night she was murdered. Detectives turned their full attention to Eli Hawthorne. His behavior had raised suspicions from the beginning, but now, with his fingerprints in Brittany Zimmermann's apartment and inconsistencies in his alibi, he had become the prime suspect. When confronted with the evidence, Eli remained calm, almost too calm. He insisted that he had never been inside Brittany's apartment except for one brief occasion when she had locked herself out and needed to use his phone. There was no proof of this claim, and investigators knew they needed more to connect him directly to the crime. Surveillance footage from the night of the murder was reviewed again, this time with a sharper focus on Eli's movements. The hooded figure captured near Brittany's building had the same general height and build as him, but the footage was too grainy to make a definitive identification. However, when detectives examined his phone records, they discovered something that sent a chill down their spines. Eli had been deleting messages and call logs from the night Brittany was killed. The forensic team recovered some of the deleted data, revealing that Eli had called Brittany multiple times in the days leading up to her murder. Some calls were brief, lasting only a few seconds, while others stretched into the early hours of the morning. He had also sent her several texts, most of them unanswered. But the most disturbing message was found in the recovered data. "I need to see you. You can't ignore me forever." It had been sent the night she was murdered. With this new evidence, detectives brought Eli in for another round of questioning. This time, his calm demeanor started to crack. When asked why he had deleted messages and call logs, he stumbled over his words, giving a weak excuse about needing space on his phone. When confronted with the fingerprint evidence, he claimed Brittany had invited him inside once, but he couldn't remember when. His answers became increasingly erratic, and detectives knew they were closing in. Then came the final piece of the puzzle: a DNA match. The skin cells found under Brittany's fingernails belonged to Eli Hawthorne. She had fought back. She had scratched him in her final moments, leaving behind the proof investigators needed. With DNA evidence, phone records, and his shifting alibi, police had enough to arrest him. The details of what had truly happened that night slowly came into focus. Eli had been watching Brittany for weeks, obsessing over her from the apartment across the hall. When she ignored his messages and calls, his obsession turned to rage. On the night of the murder, he had used a stolen key, a spare maintenance key he had secretly taken from the complex months earlier, to enter her apartment. She had likely been getting ready for bed, unaware that he was already inside. When she saw him, she had tried to fight him off, but he overpowered her. The struggle had been brief but violent. The broken lamp, the overturned chair, the half-written note. Brittany had known she was in danger in those final moments. Eli was charged with her murder. His trial exposed the dark obsession he had harbored, and he was sentenced to life in prison. For Brittany's family and friends, justice was served, but it did little to ease the grief of losing her in such a brutal way. Her death became a chilling reminder that danger sometimes lurks where it's least expected. In the weeks after the case was closed, her apartment remained empty, a haunting symbol of a life stolen too soon. The complex changed its security measures, ensuring that no one could gain access so easily again. But for those who had known and loved Brittany Zimmermann, the scars of that night would never fade.